Some sins follow you home, no matter how far you run from them. Sam Hartwell pressed his weathered palm against the frost-covered window of his Montana ranch house, watching fresh snow erase the massive pawprints that circled his property each dawn. For 3 weeks now, something had been stalking the edges of his land, something that walked on 2 legs but left tracks no man should make. The creature appeared only after midnight, prowling the fence line with an intelligence that made Sam's blood run cold. He'd lived 40 years on this isolated spread in the Bitterroot Valley, raised cattle, buried his wife, and learned to live with the kind of guilt that hollows a man from the inside. But he'd never seen anything like this. Through his rifle scope he'd caught glimpses of matted fur, elongated limbs, and eyes that reflected light like a wolf's. Yet the thing carried itself with human purpose, human rage. Last night, Sam had seen something that nearly stopped his heart. The creature was carrying a rifle. Not just any rifle, but the same Winchester his son Danny had been holding the day he died 20 years ago. What kind of creature returns from the dead carrying the weapon that killed it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rifle scope trembled in Sam's grip as he lowered it from the window, his arthritic fingers refusing to steady themselves. 20 years. 20 years since he'd buried that Winchester along with everything else from that cursed hunting trip, yet there it was, Danny's rifle, cradled in the arms of something that shouldn't exist. He shuffled to the kitchen table, where a half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels sat beside a stack of unpaid bills and veterinary invoices. The whiskey burned less these days, another small mercy in a life that had forgotten what mercy looked like. Outside, the October wind howled through the cottonwoods, their bare branches scraping against the aluminum siding like fingernails on a coffin lid. Sam had bought this ranch in 1982, back when cattle prices were steady and his marriage to Helen still held promise. Danny had been 12 then, all elbows and enthusiasm, helping his old man string barbed wire and dreaming of inheriting the spread someday. The Hartwell Ranch, 2,000 acres of prime Montana grassland nestled against the Bitterroot Mountains, where a man could raise beef and sons in equal measure. Those dreams had died on a cold morning in October 2003. The whiskey glass clinked against his teeth as Sam drained it, muscle memory guiding him through the ritual that had sustained him for 2 decades. Helen had tried to save him after Danny's death, tried to drag him to grief counselors and church services, but some wounds don't heal. They just fester until they poison everything around them. She'd filed for divorce 3 years later, taking nothing but her clothes and the wedding ring he'd given her on their 20th anniversary. "You killed our boy," she'd whispered the day she left, standing in this same kitchen with her suitcase in hand. "And now you're killing us." She wasn't wrong. Sam had pulled that trigger, had watched his son fall among the aspen leaves, had held Danny's broken body while his life bled out into the forest floor. Hunting accident, the sheriff's report had concluded. Tragic case of mistaken identity in thick brush. Case closed. But some cases never close, no matter what the paperwork says. Sam pushed himself from the table, joints protesting after 40 years of ranch work and 62 years of living hard. The cattle would need checking soon. 40 head of Black Angus that represented his entire net worth, and the only reason he hadn't eaten his own rifle years ago. The herd was his responsibility, his penance, the daily reminder that life continued even when you didn't deserve to be part of it. The floorboards creaked as he walked to the gun cabinet, muscle memory guiding him to the combination lock. Inside, 3 hunting rifles stood at attention. A 30-06 for elk, A 243 for deer, and a beat-up marlin. For varmints, Danny's Winchester should have been there too, 4th in line, but that rifle lay buried beneath 6 feet of Montana soil in the Missoula County Cemetery. So what the hell had been carrying it last night? Sam loaded the 30-06 with practiced efficiency, the familiar weight of the weapon both comforting and damning. He'd been a good shot once, good enough to put meat on the table and protect his herd from wolves and bears, good enough to kill his own son from 100 yards away. The coffee maker gurgled to life as he set it brewing, knowing sleep wouldn't come again tonight. It never did anymore, not since the creature had started its midnight visits. For 3 weeks, Sam had watched it circle his property like a predator marking territory, always keeping to the shadows, always just beyond the reach of his motion sensor lights. Sometimes it would stop and stare directly at the house, as if it knew he was watching, as if it wanted to be seen. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of snow and something else, something wild and wrong that made his cattle restless and his dogs whine. Sam's 2 border collies, Rex and Sadie, had taken to hiding under the porch after sunset, refusing their evening patrol of the property. Animals knew things, Helen used to say. They could sense what humans missed. What had his animals sensed about Danny's killer that October morning 20 years ago? Sam shook his head, banishing the thought before it could take root. The official story was all that mattered: a hunting accident, a father's momentary lapse in judgment, a son who'd wandered into the wrong patch of brush at the wrong moment. The alternative, the truth that clawed at his insides like a cancer, was too terrible to acknowledge. But as Sam settled into his vigil by the window, rifle across his lap and whiskey within reach, he couldn't escape the feeling that his past had finally come home. Something was calling in his debts, and the interest had been compounding for 20 long years. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, and somewhere in the darkness beyond his fence line something began to howl. The howling cut through the night like a blade through flesh, raising every hair on Sam's arms. It wasn't the sound of any wolf he'd heard in 40 years of ranching, too deep, too knowing, carrying an almost human quality that made his stomach clench. Rex and Sadie whimpered from beneath the porch, their claws scratching frantically at the wooden planks as they burrowed deeper into their hiding spot. Sam pressed his face to the window, breath fogging the glass as he searched the tree line. Nothing moved in the pale moonlight except the skeletal branches of cottonwood swaying in the wind. But something was out there. Something that had been watching him for weeks, measuring him, waiting for what? The howl faded into silence, leaving only the whistle of wind through the eaves and the distant lowing of anxious cattle. Sam remained at the window until dawn painted the eastern peaks pink, his rifle growing heavy across his knees, but the creature didn't show itself again. Morning brought the familiar routine that had anchored him for 20 years, the only thing standing between Sam Hartwell and the bottle that promised permanent escape. Coffee first, black and bitter as his thoughts, followed by the slow ritual of pulling on worn Carhartt coveralls and cracked leather boots. The face in the bathroom mirror belonged to a stranger, grey stubble covering hollow cheeks, bloodshot eyes nested in wrinkles carved by guilt and Montana sun. When had he gotten so old? Outside, the October air bit sharp and clean, carrying the promise of snow that would arrive within days. Sam's breath plumed as he walked the familiar path to the barn, Rex and Sadie finally emerging from their hiding spot to trail behind him, ears still pinned flat with anxiety. The dogs had been Danny's idea. Every ranch needs good stock dogs, Dad, and Sam had kept them more for memory than practicality. They'd long since given up trying to work cattle that barely tolerated their presence. The barn smelled of hay and leather and 40 years of honest work. Sam loaded feed into the back of his Ford pickup, the same truck he'd bought new in '98 when times were better and the future held possibility instead of just more empty days. The engine turned over with the reluctant growl of machinery pushed past its prime, like everything else on the Hartwell ranch. Driving the fence line was meditation and penance combined, a chance to check for breaks while cataloguing the slow decay of his life's work. Fence posts leaned at drunken angles, wire sagged where deer had jumped, and the wooden gates hung crooked on rusted hinges. Once, Sam had taken pride in maintaining every inch of boundary line, ensuring his cattle stayed where they belonged and predators stayed out. Now he made repairs only when absolutely necessary, watching his property deteriorate one broken staple at a time. The cattle gathered around the feed truck like supplicants at an altar, 40 head of prime black Angus that represented his entire net worth, and the only reason bankers still returned his calls. They were good animals, well-bred, well-fed, worth enough to keep the ranch operational for another year or two, maybe longer if beef prices held steady and the wolves didn't find his herd. Sam scattered hay with mechanical precision, counting heads automatically while his mind wandered. 39. He counted again more carefully this time, still 39. One missing from his usual 40, which meant either a cow had wandered through a fence break or something had taken her in the night. The tracks were easy enough to find once he knew what to look for. Hoofprints leading away from the herd toward the timber, accompanied by something else that made Sam's breath catch. Pawprints, massive and wrong, showing the distinctive pad pattern of a canine but far too large for any wolf. And there, pressed into a patch of soft earth near a fallen log, the unmistakable outline of a human foot. No boot print, no heel or sole pattern from manufactured footwear. Just the naked impression of toes and arch and heel, as if something had walked this path on 2 legs before dropping to 4. The prints led deeper into the forest, following a game trail Sam had known since childhood, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow more light than they should. He found the cow a quarter mile into the timber, or what remained of her. The kill was fresh, probably made just before dawn, but the feeding pattern was all wrong. Wolves took cattle from behind, hamstringing them before going for the throat. Bears typically fed on the hindquarters first. This cow had been opened from sternum to pelvis with surgical precision, her organs removed and arranged in a careful circle around the carcass like some primitive offering. Sam knelt beside the remains, his weathered hands shaking as he recognized the deliberate nature of the display. This wasn't random predation. This was a message, written in blood and viscera by something that wanted him to know it was coming for more than just his cattle. Something that had been watching him, learning his routines, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The forest around him fell silent, as if the very trees were holding their breath. The silence stretched beyond natural quiet into something oppressive, as if the forest itself had witnessed an abomination and refused to acknowledge it with sound. Sam's knees ached against the damp earth as he crouched beside the butchered cow, but he couldn't bring himself to stand. The arranged organs formed a perfect circle. Heart, liver, kidneys, each placed with deliberate care that spoke of intelligence and purpose. This wasn't the frenzied feeding of a starving predator. This was ritual. A twig snapped somewhere behind him. Sam spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he'd left propped against the truck. But the forest revealed nothing except shadows dancing between pine trunks and the slow drift of early snow beginning to fall. The first flakes of what would become winter's grip on the valley. Just like 20 years ago when Danny... Another sound. Closer this time. The soft scrape of something moving through underbrush with predatory caution. "I know you're there," Sam called out, his voice cracking with decades of whiskey damage. The words echoed back at him, smaller and more pathetic than he'd intended. "What do you want?" The answer came not in sound but in scent, the wild musk of something that lived between worlds, neither fully animal nor human. It drifted toward him on the wind, carrying memories of that October morning when he'd caught a similar smell just before his rifle spoke and his world ended. Sam forced himself to stand, joints protesting, and backed slowly toward his truck. The 30-06 felt impossibly far away, might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do him now. Whatever was out there had chosen this moment for a reason, had led him here to see its handiwork, to understand that the rules had changed. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision, something large and dark shifting between the trees with fluid grace. Not running, not hiding, but positioning itself. Hunting behavior, the kind he'd seen in wolves when they worked as a pack, except this was no pack. This was something solitary and far more dangerous. Danny? The name escaped his lips before conscious thought could stop it, a prayer and an accusation wrapped in 2 syllables. Because there, half hidden behind a massive pine, stood something that carried itself with familiar posture despite its impossible shape, the way it tilted its head when listening, the slight favor of its left leg where an old skateboard injury had never quite healed right. The creature stepped into view. Sam's mind tried to reject what his eyes reported, tried to find rational explanations for the impossible fusion of man and beast that regarded him with unsettling intelligence. 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with hands that ended in claws capable of the surgical precision he'd witnessed on his cattle. But it was the eyes that broke him, pale blue, achingly familiar, filled with an ancient hurt that Sam recognized because he carried the same wound. And clutched in those 2 long fingers was Danny's Winchester, the rifle Sam had buried with his son's coffin, now somehow returned to hands that should have been dust and memory. "This isn't real," Sam whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. Real was a relative concept when guilt had been eating at your soul for 20 years. Real was subjective when you'd spent 2 decades drowning truth in whiskey and self-loathing. The creature, Danny, his mind insisted despite logic's protests, raised the rifle with practiced familiarity, not aiming at Sam but displaying it like evidence in some cosmic courtroom. The message was clear: remember this? Remember what you did? Snow began falling harder, fat flakes that would soon blanket the valley and trap Sam in his ranch house with nothing but memories and bourbon for company. Just like that other October, when winter came early, and a father's moment of carelessness had cost everything that mattered. The thing wearing his son's eyes took a step closer. Sam faced a choice that would define whatever remained of his life. He could run back to the truck, drive home, and pretend this encounter was whiskey-fueled hallucination. Lock his doors, clean his rifles, and wait for whatever came next like he'd been waiting for 20 years. Or he could stay, could finally confront the truth that had been circling his ranch like a wolf pack, waiting for him to find courage or desperation enough to face it. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and this time his voice held steady. The creature's answer came not in words but in action. It turned and began walking deeper into the forest, following the game trail toward places Sam hadn't visited in 20 years, places where secrets lay buried beneath fallen leaves and accumulated snow. The trail that led to where it all began, where his son had died and something else had been born. Sam's legs betrayed him, despite every instinct screaming to follow, to finally confront whatever truth waited in those dark woods. His body simply wouldn't obey. His boots remained rooted to the forest floor, as if the earth itself conspired to hold him back, watching the impossible creature disappear between the pines with Danny's rifle cradled like a familiar lover. "Coward." The word echoed in his skull with Helen's voice, sharp and unforgiving as the day she'd walked out. 20 years of running from this moment, and when it finally arrived, he stood paralyzed like a deer in headlights. The snow fell heavier now, erasing the creature's tracks even as Sam watched, offering him one last chance to pretend none of this had happened. His hands shook as he fumbled for his truck keys, the metal slipping through fingers gone numb with more than cold. The engine's roar when he gunned it seemed obscenely loud in the forest's hushed cathedral, but he needed the noise, needed something real and mechanical to anchor him to a world that made sense. The drive home passed in a blur of white flakes and racing thoughts, the dead cow forgotten in his desperate need to reach familiar walls and Bourbon's numbing embrace. Inside the ranch house, Sam poured 3 fingers of Jack Daniels and knocked it back before his coat hit the floor. Then 3 more. The whiskey's burn felt like absolution, or at least postponement of judgment. He could feel the creature out there, waiting in the timber with infinite patience, but here in his kitchen he could almost pretend it was just another October afternoon on the Hartwell ranch. Almost. The bottle called to him like an old friend, promising escape from questions he wasn't ready to answer. What if following that thing into the woods meant confronting not just Danny's impossible return, but the truth about how he'd died? What if the official story Sam had been telling himself for 20 years, the hunting accident, the tragic case of mistaken identity, was just another lie wrapped around a reality too terrible to face? Sam's reflection stared back from the kitchen window, a broken man who'd traded his soul for the illusion of innocence. He'd built his life on that lie, structured every remaining day around the premise that Danny's death had been an accident. But accidents didn't come back from the grave carrying the very rifle that killed them. Accidents didn't arrange cattle organs in ritual circles, or watch their fathers with eyes full of accusation and impossible hurt. The phone rang, startling him from his spiral into self-recrimination. Sheriff Mackenzie's number glowed on the caller ID, probably checking on reports of missing livestock. Sam let it ring. Any conversation with law enforcement would require explanations he couldn't give, details about tracks that shouldn't exist, and creatures that defied every natural law. "You killed our boy." Helen's words haunted him as he poured another drink, wondering if she somehow knew what he'd really done that October morning. If she'd seen through his careful performance of grief to the guilt festering underneath like an infected wound. Maybe that's why she'd really left. Not because he'd changed after Danny's death, but because she'd realized what kind of man she'd been married to all along. The Jack Daniels level dropped steadily as afternoon shadows lengthened across the kitchen floor. Sam tried to convince himself he was gathering courage, fortifying himself for whatever confrontation awaited in the timber. But courage was a luxury he'd forfeited 20 years ago in a moment of weakness that had cost everything. What he was really doing was postponing the inevitable, buying time with whiskey while the creature that wore his son's face waited with supernatural patience. Outside, his cattle called anxiously to their missing herdmate, their lowing carrying undertones of distress that spoke to ancient instincts about predators and death. They knew something unnatural had entered their territory, something that killed with purpose rather than need, just as they'd known 20 years ago when Sam had returned from that hunting trip alone, his clothes stained with blood and his eyes hollow with fresh trauma. The animals always knew. As twilight painted the mountains purple and gold, Sam understood with crystalline clarity that his moment of choice was rapidly approaching. The creature would return tonight. He felt it in his bones like weather changes and approaching storms. It would stand at his fence line with Danny's rifle and Danny's eyes, waiting to see if his father finally possessed the courage to walk into the darkness and learn what really happened in those woods 2 decades ago. The alternative was another night of whiskey and watching from windows. Another dawn of making excuses and tending cattle while truth rotted like that butchered cow in the timber. Another year, another decade, of living half dead while his son's spirit wandered the forest boundaries, trapped between worlds by secrets that grew heavier with each passing season. Sam's hand trembled as he reached for the bottle again, knowing that each drink pushed him further from courage and closer to cowardice. The creature was out there waiting, and time was running out for redemption. If redemption was even possible for what he'd done. The bottle slipped from Sam's trembling fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor in an explosion of glass and amber liquid. The sound cut through his whiskey haze like a gunshot, and suddenly he was back in those woods 20 years ago, watching Danny fall, while echoes rolled through the timber like thunder. No more. The words came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. A place that had been buried beneath 2 decades of guilt and self-hatred. Sam stared at the spreading puddle of Jack Daniels, seeing his fractured reflection in the broken glass, and felt something shift inside his chest. The familiar weight of cowardice that had anchored him to this kitchen, this ranch, this half-life of careful avoidance. It was still there, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Danny was out there in the darkness, waiting. Not the Danny he'd buried, but something else, something wrong and impossible that carried his son's eyes and his father's sins. Whatever had crawled out of the grave or the guilt-soaked corners of Sam's mind, it deserved answers. It deserved truth, even if that truth destroyed him. Sam's legs felt steadier as he stepped around the broken glass, muscle memory guiding him toward the gun cabinet his grandfather had built from Montana pine. His hands no longer shook as he withdrew the Remington 870, checking the load with practiced efficiency. 5 shells of buckshot, enough for whatever waited in the timber, or enough to end his own suffering if courage failed him again. He pulled on his heaviest coat, the one Helen had bought him for their last Christmas together, and checked his pockets for the LED flashlight he'd carried since Danny was old enough to hunt. His boots felt solid against the porch boards, each step carrying him further from the safety of familiar walls and closer to a reckoning 2 decades overdue. The night air hit his lungs like ice water, sharp and clean after the whiskey-tinged atmosphere of the kitchen. Snow continued falling in fat, lazy flakes that muffled sound and softened the harsh edges of fence posts and machinery. In the distance, his cattle huddled against the barn's windward side, their eyes reflecting his flashlight beam like scattered stars. They watched him pass with that ancient wariness of prey animals who sensed predators on the wind. Sam understood their fear because he felt it too, not just of whatever waited in the forest, but of what he might discover about himself when the lies finally crumbled. He'd built his identity around being Danny's grieving father, the man who'd lost everything to a tragic accident. But what if he was something worse? What if he was the monster in this story? The fence line stretched before him like a boundary between worlds, separating the known from the impossible. Sam had maintained this border for 40 years, keeping his cattle in and dangers out, but tonight he would cross it. Tonight he would leave behind everything safe and familiar to follow his son's ghost into darkness that had been calling his name since the day he'd pulled that trigger. The flashlight beam caught movement at the forest's edge, a massive shape that resolved into the creature from his nightmares, standing patient as a gravestone among the pines. Even at this distance, Sam could see Danny's rifle gleaming in those two long hands, could feel those pale blue eyes measuring his resolve, testing whether his father had finally found courage or was still the coward who'd let fear pull a trigger meant for something else entirely. "I'm coming," Sam whispered, and the words carried on the wind like a prayer or a confession. He ducked between fence wires that sagged under the weight of accumulated years, feeling barbs catch his coat sleeve in a goodbye caress. Behind him lay the ranch house with its broken bottle and broken dreams, the cattle who would need feeding come morning, the telephone that would eventually ring with calls he'd never answer. Ahead waited truth in whatever form it chose to take, monster or memory, salvation or damnation. The creature turned and began moving deeper into the timber, its massive form flowing between trees with impossible grace. Sam followed, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of uncertain steps, illuminating patches of snow and shadow that seemed to shift and writhe with their own malevolent life. Each footfall carried him further from the man he'd pretended to be and closer to whatever he really was. This was his threshold moment, the point of no return he'd been circling like a wounded animal for 20 years. The safety of denial and whiskey-soaked oblivion lay behind him now, cut away clean as a severed rope. Ahead waited only the truth that had been hunting him through 2 decades of restless nights and guilty dawns. The forest swallowed his flashlight beam like a hungry mouth, and Sam Hartwell walked into the darkness to finally learn what he'd really done to his son. The creature moved through the timber with predatory purpose, leading Sam deeper along trails he hadn't walked since Danny was alive. Each step carried him further from the ranch's familiar boundaries and into a wilderness that seemed to shift and breathe around them, as if the forest itself recognized the significance of this long-delayed confrontation. Sam's flashlight beam struggled against the pressing darkness, illuminating only fragments. A moss-covered deadfall here, the gleam of watching eyes there. Things moved in the shadows beyond his light's reach, drawn by the scent of old guilt and fresh fear. He caught glimpses of shapes that might have been wolves or might have been something worse, circling at the edges of perception like vultures waiting for carrion. The creature stopped without warning in a clearing Sam recognized with sickening clarity. This was where they'd made camp 20 years ago, where father and son had shared their last peaceful moment before everything went wrong. The fire ring remained, filled now with seasons of fallen leaves and snow, but the arrangement of stones was exactly as Danny had built it with 15-year-old pride in his wilderness skills. "You remember," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind's mournful song through pine branches. The creature turned to face him, and in the flashlight's harsh glare, Sam saw details that made his stomach lurch. Patches of human skin showed through the dark fur, a birthmark on what had once been Danny's left shoulder, a scar from childhood stitches along the jawline. The fusion of man and beast wasn't random mutation but deliberate construction, as if something had taken his son's remains and rebuilt them according to its own twisted design. But it was the intelligence in those pale blue eyes that truly terrified him. This wasn't some mindless revenant driven by base hunger. This thing remembered. It knew what had happened in these woods, and more importantly, it knew why. The creature raised Danny's rifle, not in threat but in display, holding it between them like evidence in some midnight tribunal. Sam's hands tightened on his own shotgun, though he understood with growing certainty that conventional weapons would be useless here. This wasn't about firepower, this was about accountability. "I tried to forget," Sam said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "I tried to make it an accident in my mind, told myself it was the light, the shadows, that I thought you were something else entirely." The creature's head tilted with achingly familiar curiosity, the same gesture Danny had made as a child, when struggling to understand adult complexities. But there was no innocence in this version, only patient malevolence waiting for complete confession. A new sound drifted through the trees, footsteps approaching from deeper in the forest. Not the careful tread of a single hunter, but the coordinated movement of multiple figures converging on their location. Sam spun toward the noise, his flashlight revealing shapes emerging from the timber's depths, like manifestations of his darkest fears. More creatures stepped into the clearing's edge, each a grotesque fusion of human and animal characteristics. Some bore the elongated limbs and predatory features of wolves, while others showed traces of bear or mountain cat in their twisted physiologies. But all shared that same terrible intelligence, that recognition of Sam's presence and purpose that spoke to coordination beyond animal instinct. "Jesus Christ," Sam breathed, understanding washing over him like ice water. "You're not alone." The Danny creature gestured toward its companions with one clawed hand, and Sam saw the truth written in their familiar postures and movements. These weren't random monsters spawned from nightmare. They were the lost, the murdered, the victims of violence who had somehow found their way back to demand answers from their killers. A woman with a cougar's grace and two knowing eyes stepped forward, her human features still recognizable despite the predatory modifications. Sam had seen her photograph in the newspaper 3 years ago, Maria Santos, the hiker who disappeared near Glacier National Park. Her killer had never been found, but apparently he'd found her. Another shape materialized from the shadows, this one bearing the massive frame of a grizzly but walking upright on human legs. The face was that of Tommy McKenna, the hunting guide who'd vanished 5 seasons back after clients complained about his drinking and aggressive behavior. Sam remembered wondering what kind of accident had claimed him in these mountains. Now he knew there had been no accident. The creatures formed a loose circle around Sam and the thing that had been his son, their eyes reflecting his flashlight beam like scattered coals. Each one a testament to violence unpunished, to secrets buried in wilderness graves, to the guilty who thought distance and isolation would protect them from consequence. This was the new world Sam had entered by following his son's ghost into the timber, a realm where the murdered returned to hunt their killers, where justice wore claws and fangs and patience measured in decades. The rules were simple: confess or be torn apart by those who no longer had anything to lose. The Danny creature stepped closer, its grip tightening on the rifle that had ended its human life. Around them, the other hunters of the guilty waited with supernatural patience for Sam to finally speak the truth he'd been running from for 20 years. The circle of transformed dead closed tighter around Sam, their breathing creating visible clouds in the frigid air. Each exhale carried the scent of grave dirt and old blood, while their eyes held the patient hunger of predators who had waited decades for this moment. Sam's flashlight beam wavered between them, illuminating fragments of what they had been. Maria Santos's hiking boots still laced on elongated feet, Tommy McKenna's guide license hanging from a lanyard around his massive neck. But it was Danny who commanded his attention, Danny who stepped forward with that rifle raised not quite to his shoulder. The weapon gleamed with impossible preservation, free from rust despite 20 years in wilderness graves. Sam could see the scratches he'd helped his son carve into the stock, initials and dates marking successful hunts when the world still made sense. "You want the truth?" Sam's voice cracked like breaking ice. "You want me to say it out loud?" The Danny creature's head tilted with that achingly familiar gesture, waiting. Around them, the other dead shifted restlessly, claws scraping against bark and stone. They had their own killers to hunt, their own justice to extract, but they would witness this reckoning first. Professional courtesy among the murdered. Sam's knees gave out, dropping him to the snow-covered ground of their old campsite. The shotgun fell from nerveless fingers as 20 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled like rotting timber. His hands shook as he pressed them against his face, feeling the stubble and wrinkles that had accumulated during his son's long absence. "I was drunk," he whispered, the words tearing his throat raw. Not just tipsy, not just a couple beers around the campfire, drunk like I'd been getting every night since your mother filed the papers, since I found out about her and that banker from Missoula. The creature's breathing grew heavier, fog rolling from its nostrils like smoke from a furnace. Those pale blue eyes, Danny's eyes, never wavered from his father's face. I was angry at everything, at her, at you for looking so much like her, at myself for being the kind of man a woman could throw away. Sam's voice gained strength as the poison finally drained from the wound. When I saw something moving in the brush that morning, something big and brown, I didn't hesitate. I didn't call out. I wanted to kill something, anything to make the hurt stop. The Danny creature lowered the rifle slightly, and Sam saw recognition flicker across its transformed features. Not forgiveness, that was too much to hope for, but acknowledgement of truth finally spoken. By the time I got to where you fell, you were already gone. One shot sent a mass, just like I'd taught you to take game. Sam's laugh held no humor, only the bitter taste of self-hatred refined over 2 decades. The perfect shot from the perfect father, except I'd taken it at my perfect son. Around them, the circle of dead leaned closer, drinking in his confession like communion wine. They understood the weight of truth delayed, the poison of secrets that festered in living hearts while their own bodies rotted in unmarked graves. I dragged you to that ravine where the spring runoff would find you come May, made it look like a fall, like you'd been tracking wounded game and lost your footing. Sam's hands clawed at the frozen ground, nails breaking against stone and root. Then I went back to camp and rehearsed my story, the worried father searching for his missing son. I even practiced crying. The creature raised the rifle again, and this time Sam saw his own death reflected in its scope. But there was something else there too, a question that needed answering before the final accounting. The worst part. Sam met those terrible blue eyes without flinching. I was relieved, God help me, I was relieved that I'd never have to see your face again, and remember how badly I'd failed at everything that mattered. Your mother, our marriage, being the kind of man worth looking up to. The rifle's barrel pressed against his forehead, cold metal that promised ending. Sam closed his eyes and felt something like peace settle over him for the first time in 20 years. No more lies, no more pretending, no more whiskey-soaked nights trying to forget what couldn't be forgotten. I'm sorry, son. I'm so goddamn sorry. The clearing fell silent, except for the whisper of falling snow and the distant call of night birds. When Sam opened his eyes, the Danny creature was studying him with an expression he couldn't read. Not quite mercy, but not immediate vengeance either. The other dead had stepped back slightly, giving father and son space for whatever came next. The rifle remained pressed against Sam's skull, but the creature's grip had shifted. Its finger rested outside the trigger guard now, and those pale eyes held something Sam hadn't seen there before. Consideration. As if 20 years of hunting had led to this moment of choice, justice or mercy, vengeance or something else entirely. The dead could be patient. They had forever to decide. The rifle's weight against Sam's forehead felt like absolution waiting to be earned or denied. In that suspended moment, father and son existed in a space between worlds, the living and the dead, the guilty and the wronged, 20 years of lies and one terrible truth finally spoken. Then the Danny creature spoke, and Sam's heart nearly stopped. Why didn't you love me enough? The voice was wrong. A grinding rasp of vocal cords rebuilt from grave dirt and rage. But underneath the monstrous distortion lay echoes of the boy who'd once asked why the sky was blue and whether fish got cold in winter streams. Each word seemed torn from a throat that had forgotten human speech, relearned through will and hatred alone. Sam's sob came from somewhere deeper than his lungs. I did love you. God help me. That's why I couldn't face what I'd done. Loving you was the only good thing about me, and I destroyed it with my own hands. The creature's free hand reached out, claws extended, and Sam felt razor-sharp points trace the lines grief had carved into his face. 20 years of aging compressed into a single touch. Every sleepless night, every bottle emptied to silence Danny's voice. Every morning he'd woken hoping the nightmare would finally end. You made me nothing. No. Sam's voice strengthened even with death pressed against his skull. You were everything. You were the only thing that mattered, and I threw it away because I was too drunk and angry to see straight. Too weak to handle losing your mother without destroying what was left. Around them, the circle of dead pressed closer, drawn by the raw electricity of this long-delayed reckoning. Their breathing created a fog that seemed to pulse with its own life, while their eyes reflected Sam's flashlight beam like scattered stars in a cosmos gone mad. They had witnessed other confessions in other clearings, but this felt different, more personal, more final. The Danny creature's grip on the rifle shifted again, and Sam sensed a decision crystallizing in that transformed mind. Justice demanded payment, but what currency could settle a debt this vast? Death seemed too simple, too clean an ending for someone who'd spent 20 years drowning in guilt. You want to die. It wasn't a question. The creature could smell Sam's exhaustion, could read the death wish that had been growing stronger with each anniversary of that terrible morning. Suicide would be mercy, and mercy wasn't what the dead had crawled out of their graves to dispense. Yes, Sam admitted, because lies were finished between them. Every day since I pulled that trigger. The rifle moved away from his forehead, and Sam felt a different kind of terror replace the simple fear of dying. If death wasn't the sentence, what punishment could be worse than what he'd already endured? The Danny creature stepped back, gesturing toward the other dead who began closing in from all sides. Maria Santos moved with feline grace, her cougar modifications allowing her to flow between shadows like liquid death. Tommy McKenna's massive frame blocked out entire trees, while others Sam didn't recognize emerged from the timber's depths, victims of violence who'd found their way to this supernatural brotherhood of the murdered. You will hunt with us. The words hit Sam like physical blows, understanding washing over him in waves of horror. Death would be release, but this was eternal service to the very justice he'd tried to escape. To become like them, transformed into an instrument of reckoning, forced to track down other killers who thought distance and time would protect them from consequence. Danny, please. No. More. Danny. The creature's voice carried finality that echoed through the clearing. Only justice. Now. Only truth. Claws raked across Sam's chest, tearing through his heavy coat like paper. The pain was immediate and terrible, but worse was the sensation that followed, a burning that spread outward from each wound, carrying change that felt cellular, fundamental. His bones began to ache as if they were stretching, while his vision sharpened until he could see individual snowflakes falling like crystal daggers. The transformation had begun. Sam's scream echoed through the timber, a sound of anguish that would have awakened his cattle miles away if they'd still been alive to hear it. But the ranch felt like another world now, another life belonging to someone who no longer existed. Samuel Hartwell was dying in this clearing, his human form dissolving to make room for something, purpose-built, for hunting the guilty. As consciousness faded, Sam's last coherent thought was of bitter irony. He'd spent 20 years running from his son's ghost, only to discover that Danny had been running toward him all along, not for reunion, but for recruitment. The dead always needed more hunters. And who better to track killers than someone who understood intimately how it felt to pull the trigger on innocence? The forest swallowed his final human breath, and something else began learning how to breathe in his place. Dawn found something that had once been Samuel Hartwell, crouched beside the cold ashes of a 20-year-old campfire, staring at hands that no longer belonged entirely to the human world. The fingernails had darkened the color of old blood, extending into points sharp enough to carve bark from pine trees. When he flexed his fingers, tendons stood out like cable wire beneath skin that felt too tight, as if his skeleton had grown during the night while his flesh struggled to accommodate the changes. The transformation hadn't been complete. That was the cruelest discovery in a night full of horrors. He remained conscious, trapped inside a body that responded to instincts he'd never possessed. The scent of fear carried information now, painting invisible trails through the forest that spoke of prey and predator in a language older than words. His hearing had sharpened until he could distinguish individual heartbeats from creatures miles away, while his vision cut through shadow and distance with surgical precision. But worse than the physical changes was what he could feel building inside his chest, a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with justice. The burning need to hunt, to track, to corner those who thought they'd buried their crimes deep enough to escape consequence. It pulled at him like magnetic north, a compulsion that made his transformed muscles twitch with anticipation. The other dead had vanished with the darkness, melting back into whatever realm they inhabited between hunts. Only Danny remained, standing at the clearing's edge with that rifle still clutched in clawed hands. In daylight, the creature's appearance was even more devastating. Patches of human skin mottled with coarse fur, bones elongated into configurations that shouldn't support life, yet moved with fluid grace that spoke to supernatural engineering. "It hurts," Sam whispered, his voice already beginning to roughen around the edges. "God, Danny, it hurts so much." The creature that had been his son regarded him with those pale blue eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of shared agony. Good. Pain. Remembers. Pain. Teaches. Sam tried to stand and nearly fell as his center of gravity had shifted. His spine curved into a forward lean that felt natural despite 20 years of human posture. His boots no longer fit properly. His feet had lengthened, toes extending into something between human digits and animal paws. Every step on the frozen ground sent vibrations through bones that seemed to be reshaping themselves even as he moved. "What am I becoming?" The question came out as half growl, words fighting through vocal cords that no longer wanted to form human speech. "Hunter, like us, forever." The finality in Danny's voice crushed the last desperate hope Sam had been nurturing. That this might be temporary, a nightmare from which he could wake. But there would be no waking, no return to his ranch and his cattle and his bottles of whiskey. Samuel Hartwell had died in this clearing, and what emerged was something purpose-built for tracking the guilty through wilderness that never forgot the taste of blood. He understood now why the transformation felt incomplete. This was just the beginning, the first stage of becoming something that could hunt monsters in human skin. Each act of justice, each killer tracked down and cornered in places like this clearing, would add another layer to what he was becoming. The dead didn't just recruit, they evolved, becoming more perfect instruments of vengeance with every sin they punished. The hunger pulled stronger now, showing him flashes of faces he'd never seen. A man in Spokane who'd buried his wife in concrete, a woman in Billings who'd poisoned her children for insurance money, a teenager in Kalispell who set fires that killed homeless veterans sleeping in abandoned buildings, all of them confident in their safety, certain that distance and time had erased their crimes. They were wrong. "I don't want this," Sam said, though even as the words left his mouth he could feel them becoming lies. Part of him, a growing part, did want it. The hunter's purpose called to something dark that had always lived in his chest, something that had pulled the trigger on his own son and could learn to pull it on strangers who deserved it more. Danny moved closer, and Sam caught his scent for the first time. Not decay as he'd expected, but something wilder. Pine sap and snowmelt, and the iron tang of justice delayed but not denied. The creature reached out with one transformed hand and touched Sam's face almost gently, claws tracing the same lines grief had carved over 20 years. "Doesn't matter. What you want only matters what you owe. The debt was infinite. 20 years of lies had compounded into a sum that could never be fully paid, only serviced through eternal labor in the currency of other people's guilt. Sam would hunt, and in hunting he would become more like the thing Danny had become, until nothing remained of the broken rancher who'd followed his son's ghost into these woods. The forest around them began to fade, not disappearing but becoming translucent, as if the human world was losing its claim on him. Soon he would see only the trails of guilt that crisscrossed the wilderness, invisible highways that connected killers to their crimes across decades and distance. Sam's last fully human thought was a prayer that went unanswered. Then the hunger took hold, and something else began learning how to hunt. The hunger was a living thing now, coiled in Sam's chest like a snake made of fire and purpose. As it tightened its grip, the world around him shifted, not physically, but in ways that cut deeper than mere vision. The forest remained the same collection of pine and shadow, but now he could see the invisible networks that connected every living thing to their sins, threads of guilt that stretched across continents like a vast web waiting to be plucked. But something was wrong with the hunger. It should have been foreign, invasive, the spiritual parasite of his son's vengeance taking root in his transformed flesh. Instead, it felt familiar, comfortable, like coming home to a room he'd always known existed but had spent decades refusing to enter. The realization hit him with the force of divine revelation. The hunter's hunger had always been inside him. Danny's transformation, the supernatural recruitment, the physical changes, none of it had created something new. It had simply stripped away 20 years of carefully constructed lies to reveal what Samuel Hartwell had always been. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and his voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there minutes before. "I wanted this, even before. I wanted this." Danny tilted his massive head, those pale eyes studying his father with new interest. Around them, the air grew still, as if the forest itself was leaning in to witness this moment of terrible understanding. "The hunting trips," Sam continued, his transformed hands trembling as memories surfaced with perfect, damning clarity. "All those years taking you out here, teaching you to track, to shoot, to kill clean, I wasn't teaching you to hunt animals." The hunger pulsed stronger, feeding on his recognition of its true nature. Every lesson in marksmanship, every lecture about reading sign and following blood trails, every moment of pride when Danny had dropped a deer with a single shot, it had all been preparation for something else entirely, training for a different kind of prey. "I was teaching you to hunt men." The words hung in the frozen air like an accusation waiting to be judged. Sam's enhanced senses caught the shift in Danny's scent, the creature's emotional state moving from cold purpose towards something that might have been recognition. Or horror. "I used to lie awake at night," Sam pressed on, unable to stop the confession now that it had begun. "Thinking about the men who'd hurt your mother before I met her, the ones who'd made her afraid to trust anyone. I'd plan how I'd track them down if I ever learned their names, what I'd do to them in places like this where nobody would ever find the bodies." His memories crystallized with supernatural clarity, 20 years of self-deception burning away like morning fog. The hunting trips hadn't been about bonding with his son. They'd been about creating an apprentice, someone who could help him turn fantasies of justice into reality when the time came. When I found out about her affair, about the divorce, I wasn't just angry. I was excited. The admission tore from his throat like broken glass. Finally, I had a name, a face, a target that deserved everything I'd been dreaming about doing. Danny's grip on the rifle shifted, and Sam saw understanding dawn in those transformed features. The morning of the accident replayed itself with horrible new context. Sam's insistence they hunt alone, his choice of location deep in wilderness where sound didn't carry, his careful positioning that put Danny between him and where a banker from Missoula might be if he'd followed them out there. "You weren't hunting wounded game that morning," Sam said, his voice breaking on the truth. "You were tracking a man. Because I'd told you someone had been watching our camp during the night. Someone who meant us harm." The creature that had been his son stepped closer, and now Sam could see the terrible intelligence burning behind those pale eyes. Danny remembered. Not just his death, but everything that had led to it. The lies, the manipulation, the way his father had turned him into an unwitting accomplice in planned murder. "You were going to make me help you kill him," Danny said. And for the first time his voice carried clear human emotion beneath the monstrous distortion. "Going to turn me into what you are." "Yes." Sam's confession came out as a howl of anguish that echoed through the timber. "I wanted to share it with you, the hunting, the justice. I thought if we did it together, if you understood how good it felt to punish someone who really deserved it." He couldn't finish the thought, but Danny understood. In Sam's twisted logic, murder would have been a bonding experience. Father and son united in purpose, partners in a crusade that would have consumed them both. The affair, the divorce, the pain of abandonment would all be cleansed in blood spilled together. "But you saw me instead," Sam whispered, "in the brush, moving like prey, and you chose me." The words carried 20 years of accusation, but something else too, a recognition that the choice had been inevitable. When offered a target for all his rage and hunger, Sam had pulled the trigger on the most innocent life within reach. Not because he'd mistaken Danny for a stranger, but because some part of him had always known this moment would come. The hunger smiled inside his chest, finally home where it had always belonged. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that 20 years of guilt couldn't bridge. Sam's transformed hands shook as the full weight of his confession settled into the frozen ground around them, but beneath the trembling lay something unexpected: relief. For the first time since Danny's death, he had spoken the complete truth, and the hunger in his chest responded by loosening its grip just enough to let him breathe. Danny's pale eyes remained fixed on his father's face, reading expressions that were becoming less human with each passing moment. "You wanted to be this." It wasn't a question. The creature understood now that the transformation hadn't been a punishment imposed from outside, but an invitation to become what Sam had always carried inside. The supernatural hunger hadn't infected him. It had simply found its way home. "All my life," Sam admitted, his voice steadying even as his vocal cords continued their metamorphosis. "Even as a boy, I'd watched the news stories about killers walking free on technicalities, victims' families crying in courtrooms, while lawyers talked about procedure and reasonable doubt. I knew there had to be another way, a better way." The forest around them seemed to pulse with acknowledgement, as if the trees themselves had been waiting decades for this admission. Sam's enhanced senses picked up vibrations in the ground, footsteps of the other dead moving closer, drawn by the scent of a hunter finally accepting his true nature. "The ranch was perfect for it," Sam continued, surprising himself with how easily the words came now. "Isolated, miles from neighbors, room to bury mistakes where they'd never be found. I told myself I was just fantasizing, just blowing off steam after Elena left, but I was really planning." Danny's grip on the rifle shifted again, and Sam recognized the gesture from their old hunting trips. His son checking the action, making sure the weapon was ready. Some habits survived even transformation and death. That morning, Sam pressed on, needing to finish this confession while he still possessed enough humanity to form the words. "I wasn't hunting Thomas Brennan because he'd slept with Elena. I was hunting him because I finally had permission, a reason good enough to justify what I'd always wanted to do." The creature tilted its massive head, studying Sam with newfound interest. "Permission? From who?" "From myself. From the world. From God, maybe." Sam laughed, and the sound carried harmonics that made nearby trees creak in response. "Elena's affair gave me the anger. The divorce gave me the pain. Your trust gave me the opportunity. All I needed was a target." But as the words left his mouth, Sam felt something shift in the supernatural hunger. What had been driving him toward acceptance began pulling back, creating space for a different kind of understanding. The hunger wasn't just about wanting to kill, it was about wanting to be justified in killing, about finding victims who deserved what he'd always dreamed of doing. "Danny," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried perfect clarity. What if we've been looking at this wrong? The creature stepped closer, those pale eyes narrowing with suspicion. Around them, the other dead had emerged from the timber's depths. Maria Santos with her feline modifications, Tommy McKenna's massive frame, others whose names Sam didn't know, but whose stories he could read in their transformed features. All of them watching this conversation with predatory interest. The hunger, Sam continued, his mind working with supernatural clarity. It doesn't just want justice. It wants us to choose justice over love, over family, over everything that makes us human. Danny's breathing quickened, creating puffs of vapor that looked almost like smoke in the cold air. You chose to kill me. I chose wrong. Sam's admission echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. But I can choose differently now. The hunger snarled inside his chest, recognizing the threat this line of thinking represented. It had fed on 20 years of guilt, growing stronger with each anniversary of Danny's death. Each night Sam had stared at his son's photo and wished for absolution through violence. But what if there was another way? The transformation isn't complete, Sam said, understanding dawning like sunrise. That's why I can still think, still remember what it felt like to love you more than anything in this world. The hunger wants me to forget that, to become nothing but purpose and appetite, and the desire to punish. Around them, the other dead began moving closer, sensing danger to their supernatural brotherhood. They needed Sam's complete transformation, needed another hunter to join their eternal pack. But as long as he remembered loving Danny more than he'd loved the desire to kill, that transformation remained incomplete. I won't forget, Sam said, meeting his son's pale eyes with determination that surprised them both. Not what I did, not what I lost, and not what you meant to me before I let the hunger make me into something that could pull that trigger. For the first time in 20 years, the hunger felt afraid. The other dead closed their circle around Sam and Danny, their transformed features twisted with something between rage and desperation. Sam could feel their supernatural pressure pressing against his mind, 20 voices whispering that love was weakness, that sentiment would only delay the inevitable. But for the first time since entering these woods, the hunger in his chest wasn't leading the chorus. You think remembering changes anything? Maria Santos stepped from the shadows, her feline modifications more pronounced than before, as if Sam's resistance had stripped away her remaining humanity. The boy is still dead. The guilt still burns. It does, Sam admitted, his transformed hands steady now despite the weight of 20 years pressing down on them. But guilt isn't the same thing as justice, and justice isn't the same thing as revenge. Danny's pale eyes studied his father with an expression Sam couldn't read. Something caught between the monster he'd become and the boy who used to trust his father's wisdom above all else. The rifle in his clawed hands trembled almost imperceptibly, and Sam recognized the gesture from hunting trips when Danny was trying to decide whether to take a difficult shot. I taught you to choose your targets carefully, Sam continued, taking a step closer despite the supernatural pressure radiating from the assembled dead. To think before pulling the trigger, to make sure you could live with the consequences. Already dead, Danny growled, but his grip on the weapon shifted again, no longer ready to fire but not quite lowered either. Are you? Sam pressed. Because if you were just dead, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be trying to make me into what you've become. Dead things don't recruit, they just rot. But you're something else, aren't you? Something that needs others to validate what it's become. The circle of transformed hunters tightened, and Sam felt claws rake across his shoulders as Tommy McKenna's massive form brushed past him. The message was clear: finish the transformation or face the consequences. But even as supernatural fear flooded his system, Sam held his ground. 20 years I've been telling myself that you came back for justice, he said, his voice carrying across the clearing with newfound strength. But that's not why you're here, is it? You're here because you're still my son, and you're still trying to save me from what I was becoming." Danny's breath caught, creating a cloud of vapor that hung in the frozen air like a question mark. Around them, the other dead began to snarl, low, rumbling sounds that seemed to come from the earth itself. "The hunger wants me to forget that I killed you, because I loved you wrong," Sam continued, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "It wants me to believe I killed you because you got in the way of my real target. But that's not what happened." He took another step forward, close enough now to see the human features still buried beneath Danny's transformed exterior. Close enough to remember what his son's laugh had sounded like, before fear taught it to hide. "I killed you because in that moment, looking at you through the scope, I saw myself, saw what I was teaching you to become. And some part of me, the part that still remembered loving you more than I loved the hunt, decided you deserved better than turning into what I was." The rifle in Danny's hands finally began to lower, and the assembled dead responded with howls of rage that shattered the morning stillness. But Sam pressed on, knowing he might not get another chance. "The accident was real, Danny, not because I mistook you for Thomas Brennan, but because I chose you over him, chose to pull that trigger rather than let you become what I was planning to make you." "Lies," Maria Santos hissed, but her voice carried less certainty than before. "No," Sam said, his own transformation continuing even as he spoke, but changing direction somehow, becoming something that could choose rather than simply hunger. "Truth. The kind I've been running from for 20 years. He reached out slowly, carefully, until his clawed fingers touched the barrel of Danny's rifle. The metal was ice-cold and real, solid proof that some choices couldn't be undone. But it wasn't pointing at anything anymore, and that had to count for something. "I killed you to save you," Sam whispered. "And if I have to make that choice again, between becoming the hunter I've always wanted to be and protecting what's left of the boy you were, I'll make the same choice." The hunger in his chest twisted with something between fury and recognition. Around them, the other dead began to fade like smoke, their hold on this reality weakening as the foundation of their existence, Sam's complete transformation, cracked and shifted beneath them. Danny's pale eyes met his father's, and for one impossible moment, Sam saw forgiveness there. Then the creature spoke, and its voice carried human warmth for the first time in 20 years. Then, "Finish what you started." The words hung between them like a challenge written in the frozen air, and Sam felt the full weight of 20 years collapse into this single moment. Around them, the fading forms of the other dead let out one final howl of rage before dissolving completely, their supernatural forms unable to maintain cohesion without his complete transformation. But the hunger in his chest remained, coiled and waiting, offering him one last choice. Danny raised the rifle, not toward his father, but pressing it into Sam's transformed hands. The metal burned against his clawed fingers, ice-cold and impossibly heavy with the weight of what it represented. The same weapon that had taken Danny's life, now offering Sam the chance to finish what that first shot had started. "You wanted to save me," Danny said, his voice carrying echoes of the boy who used to help with evening chores, who'd fallen asleep against Sam's shoulder during long truck rides to town. "From becoming what you were, but you only half-finished." Sam's enhanced senses caught the subtle changes in his son's scent. The supernatural hunger that had animated him for 20 years was weakening, losing its hold as the truth finally surfaced between them. But it wasn't gone, not yet. The creature before him remained trapped between life and death, between the innocent boy he'd been and the monster guilt had made him become. "I don't know how," Sam whispered, his voice breaking as he gripped the rifle. "I don't know how to save you from what I've already done. The same way you did, before." Danny's pale eyes held his father's with terrible clarity. "Choose me over the hunger. Choose love over justice." The hunger snarled inside Sam's chest, recognizing the threat this represented. For 20 years it had fed on his guilt, growing stronger with each anniversary, each night he'd wished for a way to undo the past. It had brought Danny back, not as a son seeking reconciliation, but as a recruiter promising absolution through shared monstrosity. The cycle was designed to be perfect. Guilt creating hunger, hunger demanding justice, justice requiring transformation into something that could deliver it without conscience. But love had never been part of the equation. "If I pull this trigger," Sam said, his transformed hand steady despite the magnitude of what he was considering, "you'll be gone. Really gone. No more chances, no more anniversaries where you come back to test me." Danny nodded slowly, and for a moment his features shifted, the monstrous modifications fading just enough to reveal the 22-year-old face that had haunted Sam's dreams. No more tests, no more choosing wrong. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in Sam's grip, but he raised it anyway, knowing that this shot would be different from the one that had started this nightmare. That morning 20 years ago, he'd pulled the trigger in a moment of terrible recognition, seeing his own darkness reflected in what he was teaching his son to become, choosing death over corruption in a split second of desperate love. This time he would choose with full understanding. "I'm sorry," Sam whispered, his finger finding the trigger. "For all of it. For what I wanted to make you. For what I did to stop it. For 20 years of letting guilt turn grief into something hungry and twisted." "I know," Danny said, and his voice carried forgiveness that 20 years of supernatural torment hadn't been able to destroy. "I always knew." The hunger made one final attempt to stop him, flooding Sam's system with visions of justice, all the killers who walked free, all the victims crying for vengeance, all the righteous violence he could dispense if he just lowered the rifle and accepted what he was meant to become. He could feel his transformation completing itself in response to the hunger's desperation, his humanity burning away like morning mist. But underneath it all, stronger than the supernatural appetite that had defined him for decades, Sam felt something else, the same protective love that had made him pull the trigger that first time. The same fierce determination to save his son from becoming what Sam had always been inside. Danny stepped forward until the rifle's barrel pressed against his chest, directly over the heart that had stopped beating 20 years ago. His pale eyes never left his father's face, and Sam saw pride there, not for the hunter he might become, but for the father who would choose love over hunger, even when it meant losing everything. "See you on the other side," Danny whispered. Sam pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the clearing like thunder, and Danny's form began to dissolve, not into smoke like the other dead, but into something that looked almost like morning light. As he faded, his features returned completely to human, and for one impossible moment he was 22 again, whole and unburdened by the weight of supernatural hunger. "Thank you," he said, and then he was gone. The hunger died with him, leaving Sam alone in a forest that suddenly felt empty of everything except the sound of his own breathing and the weight of a choice finally, completely made. The silence after the gunshot was absolute, not just the absence of sound, but the complete erasure of 20 years' worth of supernatural pressure that had been building in this forest like a gathering storm. Sam stood motionless in the clearing, the rifle still warm in his hands, staring at the space where his son had dissolved into morning light. Then the cold hit him. Not the October chill that had been nipping at the edges of his awareness, but something deeper, the bone-deep freeze that comes when supernatural heat suddenly abandons a body that had grown dependent on its presence. Sam's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the frozen ground as his transformation reversed itself with violent speed. Claws retracted into fingernails that immediately began bleeding. Enhanced musculature deflated, leaving him feeling hollow and brittle. His heightened senses crashed back to merely human levels, and the world around him suddenly seemed muffled and distant. But it was his heart that hurt the most. For 20 years, the hunger had filled the space where grief should have lived, transforming his pain into something with purpose and direction. Now, with that supernatural appetite gone, raw loss flooded back in, not just for Danny's death, but for everything that death had stolen. The fishing trips they'd never take, the grandchildren Sam would never meet, the man his son might have become if his father hadn't been planning to turn him into something monstrous. Sam pressed his face against the forest floor and wept with an intensity that shook his entire frame. These weren't the careful, controlled tears he'd allowed himself during 20 years of guilt-managed grief. This was the full force of a father's love finally permitted to mourn without the hunger whispering that tears were weakness, that justice was the only acceptable response to loss. When the crying finally stopped, Sam found himself staring at something impossible. Footprints in the snow leading away from where Danny had been standing. Not the massive clawed tracks that the creature had left, but ordinary boot prints, size 11, the same size Danny had worn in life. They led toward the edge of the clearing, growing fainter with each step until they disappeared entirely at the tree line. Sam followed them on hands and knees, his human eyes straining to pick up details his supernatural senses would have caught effortlessly. At the spot where the tracks ended, he found something that made his heart stop, a single rifle cartridge, brass bright against the snow, still warm to the touch. It was from the shot that had killed Danny 20 years ago. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. His son hadn't been trapped in supernatural hunger all this time. He'd been trapped in the moment of his death, endlessly reliving that morning, when his father's love had chosen his destruction over his corruption. The creature Sam had been seeing, the monster that had recruited others to join its pack, that hadn't been Danny at all. It had been the hunger itself, wearing his son's face, feeding on guilt to grow strong enough to complete Sam's transformation. But Danny, the real Danny, had been there too, fighting from inside the hunger's construct, using their anniversary encounters not to recruit his father but to test him, to see if Sam could choose love over vengeance when it mattered most. And finally, after 20 years of failing that test, Sam had chosen correctly. The rifle in his hands felt different now, not like a weapon of supernatural justice, but like what it had always been, a tool that could kill or provide, depending on the intentions of the person wielding it. Sam stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, and began walking back toward the ranch. Each step felt like learning to move all over again, his body lighter without the hunger's presence but somehow more fragile too. Behind him the forest was already beginning to change. Trees that had been twisted into unnatural shapes by supernatural presence were straightening, their bark healing from the scars that otherworldly energy had carved into them. The clearing where the other dead had gathered was filling with ordinary snow, erasing all evidence of their existence. By the time Sam reached the edge of his property, the sun was fully up, painting the Bitterroot Valley in shades of gold and amber that looked almost impossibly beautiful after 20 years of seeing the world through hunger-tinted vision. His cattle were moving normally in their pasture, no longer skittish from supernatural predators that had used his ranch as their hunting ground. At the house, Sam stopped on the porch and looked back toward the mountains one final time. Somewhere up there, in a place beyond the reach of guilt and hunger and the terrible arithmetic of justice, his son was finally at peace. Not because Sam had chosen vengeance over love, but because he had chosen love over everything else, even when that love demanded the most impossible sacrifice a father could make, the choice to let go. Sam walked inside, set the rifle in its rack, and began the long work of learning how to grieve without becoming something monstrous in the process. The house felt different as Sam closed the door behind him, smaller somehow, as if 20 years of supernatural presence had been stretching its walls beyond their natural dimensions. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it hours earlier, but the familiar objects seemed to belong to someone else's life. The coffee cup on the kitchen counter, half full and stone cold. The newspaper folded to the weather section, predicting snow that had already fallen. The whiskey bottle on the table, amber liquid catching morning light like trapped fire. Sam moved through the rooms like a stranger, his human senses struggling to process a world that no longer hummed with otherworldly energy. The silence was profound, not just the absence of Danny's supernatural presence, but the complete erasure of 20 years' worth of anticipation. No more watching the calendar, counting days until the anniversary. No more scanning the tree line for pale eyes and familiar shoulders wrapped in supernatural hunger. His reflection in the hallway mirror stopped him cold. The face staring back was his own, but aged in ways that went beyond the passage of time. Deep lines carved by 2 decades of guilt. Eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. Grey stubble covering cheeks that looked hollow, almost gaunt, as if the hunger's departure had taken more than just supernatural appetite. But it was his hands that truly shocked him. Without their temporary claws, they looked impossibly fragile, liver-spotted skin stretched over bones that seemed too delicate to have ever pulled a trigger. These were an old man's hands, and Sam realized with crystal clarity that he had become exactly that during the years when grief had been his only companion. In the kitchen, he poured the cold coffee down the sink and started a fresh pot, the mundane ritual feeling both foreign and essential. As the machine gurgled to life, Sam found himself listening for sounds that would never come again. The crunch of snow under massive paws, the whisper of claws against window glass, the low growl that had announced his son's return each October. The silence was complete, and Sam understood that this was what victory looked like: an empty house, clean grief, and the terrible freedom of having nothing left to lose. The phone rang, startling him so badly he nearly dropped the coffee pot. For a wild moment, Sam's heart hammered with irrational hope, but the voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Hayes, his veterinarian, calling about the cattle he'd scheduled her to examine. "Sam? You there? I'm running about 30 minutes late. That acceptable?" Sam stared out the kitchen window at his herd, moving peacefully across pasture that no longer served as hunting ground for supernatural predators. Normal problems, normal concerns, a normal life that he'd somehow forgotten how to live. "Sam, yeah," he managed, his voice rough with disuse. 30 minutes is fine." After hanging up, Sam walked to the gun rack and studied the rifle he'd just returned. For 20 years, it had been both symbol and tool of his supernatural transformation, a weapon that could deliver justice to those who deserved it, powered by hunger that never required human mercy or doubt. Now it was simply what it had always been underneath, the instrument of his son's death, carrying all the weight that such knowledge demanded. But keeping it felt right somehow, not as a tool of supernatural vengeance, but as a reminder of love's most terrible requirements, a father's willingness to destroy what he cherished most, rather than let it become something monstrous. The coffee finished brewing, and Sam poured himself a cup, surprised to discover he was hungry for the first time in 20 years. Not the otherworldly appetite that had sustained him, but simple human need. His body finally remembering how to want ordinary things like food and warmth and rest. He opened the refrigerator and found it nearly empty, another reminder of how far he'd drifted from normal human existence. A few eggs, some milk that smelled questionable, bread that might last another day. Tomorrow he'd need to drive to town, navigate conversations with neighbors who'd watched him retreat into isolation, pretend to be someone capable of existing in the world. The prospect terrified him more than facing down supernatural hunger had. Outside, Dr. Hayes's truck pulled into the driveway, and Sam watched through the window as she gathered her equipment. Patricia was in her 50s, practical and direct, someone who'd known him before Danny's death and had never asked uncomfortable questions about his transformation afterward. She would expect the Sam Hartwell she'd always dealt with, gruff but reliable, a man who took care of his animals and paid his bills and didn't require emotional management. Sam finished his coffee and headed for the door, wondering if he remembered how to pretend to be that man. Wondering if, with enough practice, he might eventually become him. The work of living would be harder than the hunger had ever been. Sam opened the door as Dr. Hayes approached, her veterinary bag in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. She looked the same as always, steel grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, work boots that had seen decades of Montana mud, eyes that missed nothing but judged less than most. "Morning, Sam," she said, studying his face with the same clinical attention she gave sick cattle. "You look like hell." "Feel worse," he admitted, stepping aside to let her in. The honesty surprised him. For 20 years he'd deflected personal observations with grunt responses and subject changes, but the hunger had taken his capacity for small deceptions, along with everything else. Patricia set her bag on the kitchen table and poured coffee from her thermos into the mug he'd abandoned. "When's the last time you ate something that didn't come from a bottle?" Sam tried to remember and couldn't. The hunger had sustained him in ways that made ordinary food irrelevant, even repulsive. Now his stomach felt hollow, cramped with genuine need that had nothing supernatural about it. "Can't recall," he said. She opened his refrigerator, made a disapproving sound, and closed it again. "We'll look at your cattle, then I'm driving you to town. You're going to buy groceries and eat a real meal, in that order. Patricia." Not a discussion. Her tone carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing stubborn ranchers along with their livestock. "Whatever's been eating at you the past 20 years, you look like you finally fought it to a draw. Now you need to remember how to take care of the man who's left standing." They walked toward the pasture together, Patricia's boots crunching through snow that looked ordinary in daylight, no longer the supernatural canvas where otherworldly dramas had played out each October. Sam's cattle lifted their heads as they approached, but without the nervous energy that had characterized their behavior for years. They looked peaceful, almost drowsy in the morning sun. "Herd's looking good," Patricia observed, running experienced eyes over the animals. "Better than they have in a while. Less skittish." Sam nodded, not trusting himself to explain why. How could he tell her that his cattle were calmer because supernatural predators were no longer using his ranch as hunting grounds, that the strange deaths in the valley, hikers found mauled, hunters who disappeared without trace, would stop now, because the pack that had been recruiting for his transformation was finally, permanently disbanded? Patricia moved among the cattle with practiced efficiency, checking eyes and examining hooves, making notes in a small leather journal. Sam watched her work and tried to remember what normal felt like, the rhythm of seasonal care, the simple satisfaction of healthy animals and well-maintained fences, problems that could be solved with medicine and hard work rather than supernatural sacrifice. "Sam," Patricia said, not looking up from the young bull she was examining, "I know it's not my business, but folks in town have been worried about you. More than usual, I mean." "Worried how?" "Mary Fletcher at the post office said you haven't picked up mail in 3 weeks. Gas station hasn't seen you either. And there've been sounds. Howling up in these hills that doesn't sound like any wolf pack I know." Sam's blood chilled. He'd been so focused on his own transformation, on the anniversary encounters with Danny, that he hadn't considered how his supernatural isolation might appear to neighbors. How many people had heard the otherworldly sounds coming from his property? How many had noticed his absence from normal human routines? "It's been a difficult time," he said carefully. Patricia straightened, fixing him with a look that suggested she'd heard similar evasions from countless ranchers over the years. Danny's anniversary was last week. The observation hit him like a physical blow. Of course, she remembered. Small towns kept track of grief the way they tracked weather patterns, noting the seasons when certain people became fragile or dangerous or absent. "Yeah," Sam said. 20 years. Patricia's voice carried no judgment, just recognition of time's weight, long enough to stop punishing yourself for what happened. Sam wanted to tell her that punishment had been the least of it, that guilt had become something hungry and supernatural, demanding transformation into a creature capable of delivering justice without mercy or doubt, that he'd spent 20 years being recruited by forces that fed on exactly the kind of unresolved grief she was trying to address. Instead, he said, "Working on it." Patricia finished with the cattle and packed her equipment, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd learned not to push too hard against walls that weren't ready to come down. But as they walked back toward the house, she glanced at him sideways. "Whatever you've been working through," she said, "it looks like maybe you finally found the other side of it." Sam thought about Danny dissolving into morning light, about hunger dying with forgiveness, about the impossible relief of choosing love over everything else that had seemed more important. "Maybe I did," he said. They drove to town in Patricia's truck, Sam staring out the passenger window at a landscape that looked foreign despite 40 years of familiarity. The Bitterroot Valley spread before them in afternoon light, mountains rising against a sky so blue it seemed artificial, after 20 years of seeing the world through hunger-tinted vision. Ordinary ranches with ordinary cattle, smoke rising from ordinary chimneys where ordinary families lived ordinary lives. The kind of life Sam had forgotten how to want. "You're going to need to start slow," Patricia said, breaking the silence as they approached the outskirts of town. "When someone's been isolated as long as you have, normal social interaction can feel overwhelming. Don't try to explain everything to everyone right away." Sam nodded, grateful for her practical wisdom. The truth was impossible to share anyway. Who would believe that grief could transform into something supernatural? That guilt could literally hunt you until you chose love over vengeance? That forgiveness could dissolve 20 years of otherworldly hunger in a single moment of surrender? The grocery store felt like visiting an alien planet. Fluorescent lights seemed blindingly bright after decades of preferring darkness. The abundance of ordinary food, hundreds of choices for simple human nutrition, paralyzed him completely. Sam stood in the produce section for 10 minutes, staring at apples and trying to remember what preferences he'd had before the hunger made all human food taste like ash. "Start with basics," Patricia advised, appearing beside him with a cart. "Eggs, bread, milk. Things that don't require decisions." She guided him through the store with the same patient efficiency she brought to veterinary work, making suggestions without judgment, keeping conversations with other shoppers brief when they recognized Sam and approached with curious concern. Word had clearly spread that Samuel Hartwell was finally emerging from his decades-long hermitage, and the attention felt simultaneously overwhelming and oddly comforting. "Sam Hartwell?" Mary Fletcher from the post office intercepted them near the deli counter, her face bright with genuine pleasure. "Haven't seen you in ages. How have you been holding up?" "Getting by," Sam managed, surprised to discover the words felt true rather than evasive. "You know, I have 3 weeks of mail sitting in your box. Bills and such, but also a letter from some hunting magazine. They want to feature an article about backcountry safety. Apparently someone recommended your expertise." Sam's throat tightened. For 20 years, hunting had been connected to Danny's death, to guilt and supernatural transformation and the terrible hunger that fed on unresolved grief. The idea that someone might value his knowledge about something so devastating seemed impossible. "I'll pick it up next week," he said. After the grocery store, Patricia insisted on lunch at Murphy's Diner, the same restaurant where Sam used to bring Danny for pancakes after early morning fishing trips. Sitting in a booth that probably hadn't changed in 30 years, Sam ordered coffee and eggs and tried not to think about ghost memories of a 10-year-old boy drowning pancakes in syrup while chattering about baseball cards and homework and weekend plans. But the memories that came weren't painful anymore, or rather, they hurt in a clean way that felt manageable instead of consuming. Danny's laughter echoing off diner windows, syrup-sticky fingers leaving prints on laminated menus. The weight of his son's complete trust in a father who thought he knew how to protect what mattered most. "You're doing it again," Patricia observed, cutting into her chicken fried steak. "Doing what?" "Going somewhere else. Somewhere that hurts." Sam looked at her across the table, this practical woman who'd watched him retreat from the world and was now patiently helping him find his way back. "I was remembering bringing Danny here. Sunday mornings after fishing. Good memories. The best." Sam surprised himself with how true that sounded. "For a long time I couldn't think about them without everything else getting in the way. The guilt, the anger. But right now they just feel like what they were. Good times with my son." Patricia nodded slowly. "Grief changes shape over the years. Gets lighter if you let it. Doesn't disappear, but it stops being the only thing you can carry." Sam ate his eggs and tried to absorb that wisdom. For 20 years, grief had been a hungry thing demanding supernatural transformation. Now it felt like simple human sadness, profound but manageable, painful but not destructive. The difference between a wound that festers and one that heals clean. Driving home as afternoon faded toward evening, Sam watched familiar landmarks pass and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: anticipation for tomorrow. Not the dread of approaching anniversaries or the hunger for otherworldly justice, but genuine curiosity about what an ordinary day might contain. Groceries to put away, cattle to tend, maybe a letter about hunting safety to consider answering, the simple work of being human again. As Sam pulled into his driveway, the headlights swept across snow that looked silver, white instead of the crimson-tinted canvas it had been for 20 years. He sat in the truck for a moment after shutting off the engine, listening to the absolute silence that had replaced 2 decades of supernatural anticipation. No otherworldly howls echoing from the tree line. No massive shapes stalking the perimeter with familiar, devastating purpose. Just the wind through pines and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. He carried the grocery bags into a house that felt larger somehow, as if the absence of supernatural presence had created actual space where none had existed before. In the kitchen, Sam unpacked ordinary food and tried to remember the rhythms of normal meal planning. Eggs for tomorrow's breakfast, bread that would last the week, coffee that tasted like comfort instead of necessity. The letter from the hunting magazine sat on his kitchen table where he'd placed it after retrieving his mail. Sam studied the envelope while putting away groceries, running his fingers over his name written in professional script. Someone wanted his expertise about backcountry safety. Someone thought Samuel Hartwell had knowledge worth sharing about preventing the kind of tragedy that had destroyed his family. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 20 years, he'd believed Danny's death proved his fundamental failure as both father and hunter, evidence that he couldn't protect what mattered most when it counted. But maybe survival itself was a form of expertise. Maybe living with impossible grief, and eventually finding his way back to love qualified as knowledge worth passing on. Sam opened the letter carefully. The magazine wanted a first-person account of hunting accident prevention, emphasis on the human element rather than technical safety measures. They'd heard he had personal experience with tragedy and recovery. The fee they offered was generous, enough to cover ranch expenses for several months. He set the letter aside and prepared his first real meal in 20 years. Scrambled eggs with actual flavor, toast that didn't taste like ash, coffee that warmed him from the inside instead of simply providing caffeine for supernatural endurance. Each bite felt like a small victory over the hunger that had sustained him for so long. Outside the kitchen window, November dusk settled over the Bitterroot Valley in shades of purple and gold. Sam watched his cattle move slowly toward the shelter of the barn, their behavior calm and predictable. Tomorrow he'd need to check the water tanks, repair a section of fence that had been damaged in last week's storm, call the feed store about winter hay delivery. Normal problems with normal solutions. The phone rang as he finished eating. Sam almost didn't answer. 20 years of isolation had made him instinctively wary of unexpected contact, but something about the evening's ordinary momentum made him reach for the receiver. "Sam?" The voice belonged to his neighbor, Jim Morrison, whose ranch bordered his eastern pasture. "Hope I'm not calling too late. Wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" "Whatever you did about those wolves, it worked. Haven't lost a single calf in 2 weeks. Haven't even heard howling. Mary's been sleeping through the night for the first time in months." Sam gripped the phone tighter, understanding that Jim was referring to the supernatural pack that had been recruiting him, the otherworldly predators whose presence had terrified both animals and humans throughout the valley. Their elimination had created ripple effects he hadn't anticipated. Peace for neighbors who'd lived in fear, safety for livestock that had been hunted by creatures operating beyond normal predator behavior. "Just doing my part," Sam managed. "Well, whatever your part was, the whole valley appreciates it. Mary wants to invite you for dinner Sunday if you're interested. Nothing fancy, just pot roast and decent company." After hanging up, Sam sat in his kitchen and tried to process the invitation. Sunday dinner with neighbors. Conversation over home-cooked food. The kind of social obligation he'd avoided for 20 years, too consumed by supernatural transformation to participate in ordinary human community. But the prospect didn't terrify him the way it had even a week ago. Instead, he felt something approaching curiosity about what it might be like to sit around someone else's table, to talk about weather and cattle prices and local news instead of grief and guilt and otherworldly justice. Sam picked up the magazine letter and read it again more carefully. They wanted 800 words about hunting safety from a personal perspective. 800 words about preventing the kind of accident that had killed his son and nearly destroyed his humanity in the aftermath. He found a pen in the kitchen drawer and wrote across the bottom of the letter, "Yes, will deliver by month's end." Outside, the first stars appeared in a sky that looked infinite and clean. Sam turned off the kitchen lights and walked through his house, checking locks out of habit rather than fear. In the hallway mirror, his reflection showed an old man who looked exhausted but not broken, weathered by grief but not consumed by it. Tomorrow would bring ordinary challenges requiring ordinary responses, the simple, difficult work of being human again. For the first time in 20 years, that felt like enough.